Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Ever since Anthony Albanese won the election a week and a half ago, there's been an extreme focus on Australia's foreign policy. The Prime Minister's first act was to head to Tokyo for the Quad meeting with the US, India and Japan. Then Foreign Minister Penny Wong jetted off to Fiji, while Anthony Albanese revealed his next trip would be to Indonesia. At the same time, China's Foreign Minister is currently touring South Pacific nations in the wake of Beijing's security partnership with the Solomon Islands. Professor James Curran is a professor of modern history at the University of Sydney and a columnist for the Australian Financial Review. James, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much for having me.
How usual is it for there to be such a focus on international relations so soon after an election?
Pretty unusual, I think. I don't think there is a precedent, in fact, for a Prime Minister being sworn in on the same day as then taking off to a really important and significant international gathering. So taking the oath of office and then within hours being on an aeroplane flying to Tokyo for a Quad leaders meeting just shows you, I think, the priority that the new government puts on foreign policy. I don't think they had any option in that regard. This meeting had been set for some time, but I think it nevertheless showed that they wanted to get off on a very strong foot on this question, showing continuity where they could, but also showing some differences as they did.
Okay, so, watching that first week, Anthony Albanese, particularly with Joe Biden, also Penny Wong in Fiji, how do you think they performed? Let's start with the Quad meeting. How do you think Albanese, how do you rate his appearance at the Quad?
Look, I think he ticked all the boxes. I don't think he could have done anything different. He established very good relationships with the American president and with the other leaders from Japan and indeed India, who I think were all quite appreciative, quite amazed really that you could have a leader sworn in and then attend this meeting so quickly. I think they appreciated the fact that Albanese was signalling a very strong commitment to the quadrilateral grouping. We all know that even if they don't talk about this meeting being principally about China, that it certainly is. It has taken on other tasks in relation to vaccines and other issues. But in essence, they are all there to swap notes about China and China's new assertion. And some of them are more obvious about that than others. The American president said that it is about autocracies versus democracies. But Albanese, I think, performed very well, very safe, very sure, very certain in everything that he did. I think they'd had the benefit of preparing for this for some time. The Labor Party had been involved in an earlier Quad meeting earlier this year in February in Melbourne when the foreign ministers gathered. So Albanese, I think, made it very clear too that his priority would be climate action, climate change policy, but stressing, I think, a certain agreement as well on the other objectives. There's no question that Labor, I think, ticked all the boxes on that visit.
What about Penny Wong and her trip to Fiji?
Even more crucial, I think, as well, just in the sense that there is so much Chinese diplomatic pushing going on in the region at the moment. As we know, her counterpart from Beijing, Wang Yi, is on a 10 or 11 nation stop tour through the Pacific in terms of trying to sign up Pacific countries to some kind of security agreement. I thought Penny Wong's performance was exactly the right kind of tone that needed to be brought. We do know that previous governments were aware of Chinese activity and Chinese influence building in the Pacific, but their response was shown to be inadequate, particularly during the election campaign, of course, when we saw the signing of a security agreement between Beijing and Honiara and the Solomon Islands. There's been a lot of talk about bringing diplomacy back, bringing statecraft back, bringing a new tone to Australia's engagement with the world. And there's no question that when Penny Wong gets up in Suva in Fiji and talks about the Pacific family and talks about not having strings attached to Australian support, but I think even more significantly, it was the framework, Sean. She talked about the fact that Australia was going to articulate its position on the world stage through the prism of just the very basic fact that it would have a First Nations foreign policy, that it would celebrate the 270 ancestries that make up the Australian population, that these two kind of core elements of modern Australia are going to be part of Australia's international personality, that there'll be a real emphasis on that.
Yeah.
I think big ticks for this new government within the first week. They haven't completely, and nor can they, reset some of the more difficult problems in Australian foreign policy, like that relationship with China, but they've already shown their preparedness to put a different framework around it.
Well, how important was the fact that Chinese Premier Li Keqiang got in touch with Anthony Albanese to congratulate him? That was the first time in a couple of years we've had such high-level messages between two leaders. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct. Really, it's the first time since 2018 that there has been any kind of high-level contact of that kind. Now, two things worth bearing in mind here, I think, Sean, are these. Firstly, this is in essence normal diplomatic protocol, right? For a foreign government to congratulate the leader of the winning party at a federal election. Secondly, we need to remember too that the same message was, well, in fact, it was a message in 2018, I'm sorry, that's right, after then Prime Minister Scott Morrison met with Li Keqiang at a summit in the region. But Li Keqiang said he hoped that Scott Morrison would turn the relationship around after some of the tensions in the Turnbull years. So, look, the timing of it, as I say, is standard diplomatic protocol, but there's a context we can't ignore, and that's the fact that China still has its tariff boot on the Australian neck. So it makes it very difficult for Australia to respond as enthusiastically as China might hope. But at the very least, we know that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have talked about the need for engagement at some point. Now, this will take time. There needs to be reciprocity. There needs to be some signals from Beijing as well as from Canberra about how they want to take this forward. But at the very least, it's a positive sign, but it's not an easy message for the Australian government to get too excited about, as I say, when there's still economic coercion taking place and when we've got two Australian citizens that are detained in Beijing on some murky charges.
Stay with me, James. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is James Curran, Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney. So how does this evolve? Where do we end up, James, in terms of our relationship with China? I appreciate it will take time, but it's really hard for the layperson like me to kind of see how the thaw begins even.
Yes, I think it is going to take time. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Australian government to move while those tariffs are still on Australian exports, while there's still the coercion going on. That really doesn't give a new government much flexibility at all. Now, there's lots of other stuff that can be done in terms of thinking a bit more conceptually about how all the various parts of the Australia-China relationship fit together. And I've made that argument. Now, that is not going to be the silver bullet. But what we have seen over the last 4 years, and of course, notwithstanding the legitimate worries that arise from China's new assertiveness, what we have seen is some, I think, pretty guileless foreign policy from the previous government in terms of beating the drums of war, in terms of picking fights where they weren't necessary, and in terms especially, I think, of not doing enough to reassure the Chinese Australian community that their contribution to the national fabric and to Australia's history and its cohesion as a community, that's got to be more, I think, valued. And I don't have any doubts that this new government will put its shoulder to that wheel. You can already tell Senator Wong has started that process. So there's lots that can be done at the ground level, at the community level. We've got the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship coming up in December of this year. That is surely an opportunity to at least look at some of the positive dimensions of this relationship over the last 5 decades. I think it's going to be incremental, and I think it's going to go have a couple of steps forward sometimes, maybe some back. We are dealing with a different China. The old model of engagement is gone. So we've got to learn to manage this relationship, protect Australian interests. But I think, really think it through before leaping on to the beating of drums, which tended to be the last government's default position.
Okay, and overlaying this, of course, is China's role in the region. Obviously, the deal with the Solomon Islands being the standout example of that, but the current tour of the region, I mean, that's difficult to manage as well.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. I mean, the dominant theme of Australian foreign policy since the late 19th century at least has been the search for security in the Pacific. And so many governments have been worried, whether or not it be Japan during the First World War getting hold of islands in the North Pacific that the Germans had to give up, and using them as launch pads potentially of strategic intimidation. So it is of deep concern. We know that Obama was told by Xi Jinping in 2015 in Washington that China did not intend to militarize the rocky outcrops or shoals or reefs that it was taking possession of in the South China Sea. They've said that the Solomon Islands won't be a military base, and so has the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands. But there's absolutely no question that we may well now be seeing a new pattern where China believes that following the investments that it makes in the region, it therefore has the right to protect those investments with police and to protect its diaspora communities. And it's not too far from that towards sort of seeing these places become part of a Chinese strategic network in the region that will trouble and complicate not only Australia's strategic position, but of course the ability of the United States as well to project power in the Western Pacific. So there's lots of concerns there. It's a huge, huge agenda for the new government to face.
And just before we finish up, James, I do want to talk about the US just a little bit and Australia's engagement with the US. Obviously, incredibly close allies for many, many decades. But that isn't always the best place to be when you sit in the middle of Asia as a country either.
No, I mean, look, I think we really have no option but to go with the United States. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that we're always going to be in lockstep with them on every aspect of their policy.
Yeah.
Now, there is going to be a lot of pressure. There already is a lot of pressure in Washington from both sides of American politics for a much stronger tone on China. And we've already seen President Biden chip away at the whole policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan.
Yeah.
Where traditionally the Americans have left it vague or hypothetical as to whether or not they'd come to Taiwan's defense in the event of an attack from China. There are going to be some more forward-leaning postures, I think, by Washington, which may well make not only Australia but some of America's other allies a little bit nervous. So from time to time, whilst obviously I think Australia has done so much, obviously, to invest in the alliance. There's not much more Australia could do to prove its alliance loyalty, both in the past and in terms of what it's doing now. But from time to time, I think, Sean, a good ally is one that offers advice, counsel, and that sometimes disagrees with Washington where our interests aren't necessarily 100% aligned. Now, some people might say, well, that's crazy. We're always going to be 100% aligned on the threats that are facing this region. Not necessarily. And so I think we've got to have the courage at times to have those disagreements in private. You don't need to wash the dirty laundry in public, but that's the kind of ally that Washington really needs. It doesn't need an ally patting it on the back and pushing it into potentially problematic policy responses.
James, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
My pleasure.
That was James Curran, Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney. James also has a book coming out. It's due for release in August, Australia's China Odyssey, From Euphoria to Fear. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.